It's really a pleasure to be here because the first time I came for the Association of International Relations, it was about 2 or 3 years ago. And even in the 2 to 3 years that it's been since then, the changes here in Baku have been phenomenal. I would argue that perhaps there's no place in the world that you see change as quickly as you do in this region of the world. And so we're talking about energy today, and I think my panelists before me have done a great job of laying out the broad framework of energy and why energy is so crucial, why when it comes to international relations, whether it's theory or practice, we need to think critically about energy security, particularly in this region of the world, since it's become so critical, and energy as a scarce resource is something that human beings throughout history have always found ways of using either for good or for bad. But I'm not an energy expert. I'll be very candid with you. I live in Washington. I've worked as an academic. I've worked in the US government. So what I'd like to do is to basically give you a view on how geopolitically we think about energy. I would argue that while in the past energy was the only thing that many people thought about when they thought about Azerbaijan, right now in Washington I would make the argument that Azerbaijan might be too narrowly focused on energy. Most of the debates that I see in Washington, anytime I see Azerbaijan, it's never just by itself. It's with SOCAR, it's with the Turkic world, it's always in the context of energy. And it seems it's very easy, particularly in the West, where there are already misconceptions about Azerbaijan. There's already a feeling that within South Caucasus, the Armenian story is very well known, the Georgian story is very well known, but most people don't know where Azerbaijan is, and I hate to be the bearer of that news. I don't think it will surprise any of my friends who visited, but the argument is, how do you change that? And for the last couple years, it seems that the answer to that is that Azerbaijan is an energy player that, despite being small, it's a big power in energy. I would argue that while this is well guided, there are other ways to think about things. And so therefore, I want to take a broader view for a second to then think about it. When you think about some of the changes that we heard earlier today about the larger geopolitics, it's phenomenal to think about the moment in time we live in. And I would argue that there's no better time to live than in the present if you're in Azerbaijan. If you had lived back in the days of the 19th century, Azerbaijan lived through these days, but not as an independent republic. There was no place for a small republic with the population size and the energy resources, because some other empire would simply come and take you. Throughout history, that's been the story of very small states like Azerbaijan. But in this day and age, there is at least some modicum of international norms, legitimacy, law, and as we all know, these things are constantly evolving, and the great powers choose to intervene and choose to make their rules as they go along. It's a source of great frustration in a place like Azerbaijan, I know. But I think the transformation that we've seen from the Cold War and from the US perspective, a post-9/11 environment, and a focus on non-state actors has given a particularly importance to Azerbaijan. When I think about history, and I'm a great student of history, and I think about great empires, Azerbaijan, most of the time, we start out by saying it lives in a very bad neighborhood. It's dangerous. When you have neighbors like the Russians to your north and the Iranians to your south, the Turks to your west, and everything to your east, it's very easy to become very depressed and say, that's the end of my speech, I'm going to go home and cry. But that's not the end of the story, actually, right? Because I think on every opportunity and every challenge, there is always the opportunity. In fact, when I grew up in Japan, the Chinese character for crisis actually has both opportunity and challenge, right? And so I think in many ways, that's the perspective I'd like to think about. Now, I've argued before that Azerbaijan should be seen as Eurasia's hinge. I know many people in Azerbaijan like to talk about Azerbaijan as the heart of Eurasia. And I think this concept of Eurasia, which was not very popular, slower. I think this concept of the heart of Eurasia is an interesting one, because it reflects the geographic reality of Azerbaijan that perhaps was not as appreciated in the past. Today, as we think about the world and the way we structure things, most of the great economies of the world are on big waterways. So when you think about China on one end, the United States on the other, the Soviet Union no longer exists. So while it is a great power, it's not a superpower anymore. Where does that leave a state like Azerbaijan? Well, in my mind, it leaves Azerbaijan with the opportunity to be able to have a coalition. And I think in particular, when you think about what Azerbaijan has been doing with its energy resources, what it's trying to do, what we heard earlier, these are all steps in the right direction. But I would argue that there's a lot more that could be done. I think that labeling yourself or being able to market or position yourself is particularly important. Even in this conference, I would argue, and this is no insult to our wonderful organizers, there's always a discussion. Some people talk about the South Caucasus, some people talk about the Caspian, some people talk about the Turkic world, some people talk about the post-Soviet space. All of these are identities. You can be all of them at the same time. There's no need to be one or the other. As an American, the term Caucasus does not have a very positive connotation. Particularly after the Boston bombings, when you say the word Caucasus, we think Chechnya. That's the last thing I think Azerbaijan is or should want to be seen as. So I would argue this new idea of being able to link it more to the Caspian energy resources, to be able to link it more to the Turkic world that is rising in power, as we've seen the Republic of Turkey do over the last 10 years, and being able to think about being the connecting point of this great Silk Road that runs all the way from the Adriatic to the Great Wall of China. This is a concept that I think many Americans and geostrategists are particularly interested in. Now, we've heard a lot about kind of the contrast between the Americans trying to figure out what to do but not being a real player, since we don't have the American expression as a dog in the fight. I don't think that translates very well. But we don't have the same level of interest because we're not around as much in this region of the world. And when we have a president that's not as keen on putting American bases or putting American boots on the ground, we're much more focused on economic power and on soft power than we are in hard in this region of the world, partly because we're at a major disadvantage in this region, particularly given Russia's view on things and given Russia's resurgency. But I think it's particularly critical for Washington to understand that a place like Azerbaijan, just like Eastern Europe in the fall of the Soviet Union, doesn't require that much investment. You don't need our money. You do not need our resources. But you need our help in a lot of ways. A lot of the major conflicts that Azerbaijan faces in the world today are things that you cannot solve on your own. They're also things that the United States by itself cannot do. But particularly as you look at what Azerbaijan has done in the last couple of years, sitting on the UN Security Council, being able to use its energy resources to do the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, TANAP, all these things, other players are beginning to come more and more here. In the past, you would have to go out and explain yourself to others. Now we're coming to you to understand what's going on. And I would argue that to be able to work effectively with your partners around the world, you first have to start at home and then go global. You can't simply say, okay, we have money, we're going to buy our way into this international game. Because you can do that, but that's not sustainable. And as we've heard throughout today, the way in which you do that is to diversify and to take the energy that may be the starting point and go beyond that. I really like the comments I've heard before when I've come through town. Many of your leaders use the term to take black gold and turn it into human gold. I really like this idea. Now, it sounds very nice, but how do you actually do it? I would argue you have to focus on one strategic area that I think this room represents well. You need to focus on thought leadership. You need to focus on the next generation. If you don't focus on your youth today that are growing up in this century, not the 20th century, how can you understand how to deconstruct the world in which we live in? The world is changing so quickly and dynamically that as we're speaking here right now, there's entire debates happening on cyberspace. I always find it interesting. I've just recently started using Twitter and Facebook, and Azeris are very active on both of these forums, just like the Turks are. And it's very interesting. Anytime someone like myself says, I'm going to Azerbaijan, you can imagine the types of Twitter feeds I get. There's the attackers, and then there's the great. This is really exciting. We're glad you're visiting us. So we can have as much of a debate as we have here, but the way that debate is portrayed out there is even more important. And I would argue that that's a place that Azerbaijan has not competed in successfully yet, particularly in the English language in the United States. I think the role of the private sector is very important here. I think having SOCAR and having these large state oil and enterprises is very important, but they alone cannot fly the flag. I would argue that the world of diplomacy, the world of 21st century statecraft that my former boss Hillary Clinton talks a lot about, is no longer just the purview of government leaders. I would say the days of government leaders who were able to dictate everything they wanted in the world is forever over. Not just because they may not be as powerful in their own individual countries, but because the world has changed. The power of the individual has changed fundamentally, and it's going to be the next generation, the demographics that we see changing around us that will make those changes important. So I think we have to be focused on the future. You come from your past, you can never escape your past, but there's always a silver lining. There's always a way of taking that past as a point of connection. And so rather than focusing on the negative, to focus on the positive. And I think in particular, figuring out ways that you can empower your business community, figuring out ways of using these resources you have to diversify throughout, whether it's in the technology space, whether it's in your universities, or whether it's in being able to reach out and go beyond and turning yourself from a net receiver of development assistance to a net giver of development assistance, as the way we've seen Turkey do over the last couple of years. It's particularly important. But I think the story of Azerbaijan and the story of energy, they connect at different points in time, but if you simply focus your energy on only one or the other, you don't get the broad depth and history that I think this country and the people in this country deserve. It always gives me great hope when I come back, because I meet young people that are represented in this room and scholars who are trying from a sincere point of view to understand the world. I think unfortunately when you go back to your capitals and you go back to your countries, there's a feeling sometimes that you can only see the world from your national interests, and certainly in Washington this happens a lot. But when you travel, when you connect, when you build up a community of scholars, when you have sincere debates where even if I disagree with you, I will listen to you out of respect as a fellow human being, that type of discussion, that type of diplomacy, that is the future. And if we can figure out a way to work together towards that future, all of the challenges, and there are many in this region of the world, will be able to be overcome. And I know that sounds a little bit like kumbaya, as we say in English, where it sounds too good to be true. It's like a utopian dream. But perhaps I'm a naive optimist because I'm a little bit younger than most people think I am. But I think if we don't focus and we don't have this mentality, then the challenges that we face together will simply depress us, and we'll go back home and simply try to make money as opposed to trying to make the world a better place than when we found it here. So